Great. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Climate Progress in Vermont, Working Toward Cleaner Transportation, Heat, and Electricity. And thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lauren Hurl, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters, and I'm going to be facilitating our conversation today. VCV is a statewide, nonpartisan nonprofit that works to advocate for strong environmental policies, hold lawmakers accountable, and we work to help elect pro-environment candidates. And it's really great to be with you all. I'm going to walk through our webinar logistics and agenda, and I will introduce our speakers. And before we get started, please keep yourself muted during this presentation so we can hear our speakers. But please use the chat freely and get in your comments, questions, ideas. We're early in the process, so really eager to hear from you all and engage with you all. So our goals for today are to give you a sense of the state of the state on climate action in Vermont. And I know so many people, including many of you, have been working so incredibly hard to develop our state's climate action plan, to pass critical legislation, and to implement projects in communities all over the state. And today we want to share some updates on many of the big climate efforts underway and identify some of the next essential steps that we need to take. And we'll also talk a bit about how you all can get and stay involved. So a few pieces of kind of big picture context that I think are worth mentioning before we get into the meat of it. In December 2021, the state adopted its first ever statutorily required climate action plan. A number of aspects of that plan are moving forward. Notably, last year, lawmakers invested historic sums in climate initiatives, including municipal energy resilience, weatherization programs, electric vehicle incentives, fare-free public transit, and lots more. They also passed the state's first comprehensive environmental justice bill, helping ensure that we have a just transition to a clean energy future. Lawmakers attempted to pass a clean heat standard, which was one of the core recommendations of the state's climate action plan to address our thermal sector. As I'm sure you know, that bill was vetoed by Governor Scott, and legislators fell one vote shy of overriding that veto. Meanwhile, though, the federal government passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which finally make serious federal funding available to Vermonters to access clean energy technologies. And this really changes the landscape for the better and is an opportunity that we need to look to maximize in our policies and programs, especially when it comes to making more electric heating, transportation, and renewable energy options that are available to all Vermonters. Couple other pieces of context. We have, of course, have an election coming up on November 8th. Remember to vote. This will determine what direction our country and our state will be headed in. We do know that no matter what happens, we already know we're going to be seeing major turnover in the Vermont legislature. There were numerous retirements this year, so we're going to have a huge influx of new lawmakers, which I think underscores the need for all of us advocates, community members, returning legislators to engage and support our new legislative partners in understanding these complicated issues and the next steps that we need to take to address climate pollution and take advantage of the huge opportunities we have in front of us to help Vermonters have cleaner, more affordable ways to heat and power our homes and get where we need to go. So with that brief context, I'm going to walk through today's agenda and introduce our speakers. First, we're going to get an update on the 2022 Energy Action Network Annual Progress Report and a quick Climate Council update from Jared Duval. Jared is the Executive Director of the Energy Action Network, a diverse network of more than 200 nonprofits, businesses, public agencies, and others working together to achieve Vermont's climate and energy commitments. And he's also a member of the Vermont Climate Council and co-chair of the Climate Council's Science and Data Subcommittee. After we hear from Jared, we're going to hear about the importance of legislative leadership and grassroots engagement from Representative Kathleen James. Representative James is from the Bennington 4 district in the Vermont State House. She was first elected in 2018. She's active in a number of legislative caucuses, including on the leadership team of the Vermont Climate Solutions Caucus. In 2018, she won VCV's Rising Star Award for her leadership on environmental policy in the State House. After we hear from Representative James, we're going to hear from some brief issue overviews and updates from some of our experts. First, we're going to hear from Johanna Miller, who will discuss our transportation sector. Johanna is the Energy and Climate Program Director at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. She's also a member of the Vermont Climate Council and organizes the Vermont Energy and Climate Action Network, VCAN, and much more. We'll hear next about the thermal sector from Ben Edgerly-Walsh. Ben is the Energy and Climate Program Director at the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, VPIRG, where he works to research, identify, and advance clean energy policy solutions for Vermont. And finally, we'll hear about the electric sector from Chase Whiting. And Chase is a staff attorney on the Conservation Law Foundation's Clean Energy and Climate Change team in Vermont. And in this role, he engages in strategic litigation and advocacy with a goal of mitigating the causes of climate change and helping New England transition to clean energy and transportation solutions. So after we hear from this impressive lineup of speakers, we have built in lots of time for Q&A. So again, please put your questions, suggestions, thoughts in the chat. We're going to, in general, save questions for the end, but we will be monitoring it and we're going to do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can. And with that, thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Jared Duval now. Go ahead, Jared.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Really glad to be with you all. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let me start the slideshow. Lauren or Greta, can you just give me a thumbs up if that looks all good to you? Great. So hi, everybody. As Lauren said, my name is Jared Duval, and the organization that I lead, the Energy Action Network, every year produces this report. One of our big goals is to make sure that as a state, Vermont is having an evidence-based, fact-based, really informed conversation about energy and climate policy with the latest and highest quality available data and information. So this report covers emissions, energy, equity, and the economy. And I'm just going to go through today some of the highlights from this report, which just came out last month to help ground our conversation. I will note before I dive in that every graphic you will see from this report is available online on the eanvt.org website. So if you would like to use it, if your organization, if your energy committee, if you do a newsletter, anything that you're working on, we produce this to be an open source resource for organizations across Vermont, for anybody in the state of Vermont working on these issues. The mission of our network is to meet Vermont's emissions reduction requirements and renewable energy goals. And so this report is really a contribution to the entire state. So here are some of the key takeaways of this year's report. You know, the Global Warming Solutions Act passed in 2020. And one of the things that act did was struck the word goals around emissions reduction and replaced it with the word requirements. And they are now Vermont has legally binding emissions reduction requirements that shall be met. As part of that, as Lauren said, the legislature created the Vermont Climate Council to craft Vermont's first climate action plan for how we could meet both those emissions reduction requirements and the other goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act with relation to resilience and adaptation and an equitable and just transition. This year's report shows that we are not currently on track to meet the emissions reduction requirements for 2030. The main reason for that is that many of the key policy recommendations that were in the Climate Action Plan have failed to advance. Briefly, there were three major significant policy recommendations, and that word significant actually had a definition in the Climate Action Plan, could have meaning that those actions could have achieved more than 10% of the needed emissions reduction requirements. So there were three significant policy recommendations in the Climate Action Plan. One was Vermont joining the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which fell apart last year with some states pulling out, Second was adopting a clean heat standard. That was the largest single emissions reduction strategy recommended in the CAP. That has also not moved forward. The one significant recommendation in the climate action plan that has moved forward is continuing to follow California's rules with regard to vehicle sales, known as Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks. That rule, which is in process right now, if Vermont continues to follow California's stronger, higher standard than the federal government, we will likely see that those rules alone achieve 10 to 15% of the needed emissions reductions by 2030, or about a third of what the transportation sector as a whole needs to do. And that is by virtue of requiring an ever increasing share of new vehicle sales to be zero emissions vehicles. But that is the only one of the significant policy recommendations that has thus far moved forward. Some of the other key findings is that this is not just about a legal requirement or a moral responsibility. This is about an economic opportunity, both for Vermonters and for the Vermont economy as a whole. Meeting the climate action plan was modeled in terms of the economic effects. And what was found was that by 2050, an estimated $6.4 billion in savings and avoided damages by taking the actions that the plan calls for. And then finally, that we need to remember that there are opportunities across the board for pollution reduction and cost savings. But the elephant in the room is that about 3/4 of our climate pollution and about the same amount of our energy costs come from our reliance on fossil fuels in the transportation and thermal sectors. And yet we still have no sector-wide policies to reduce those emissions and hold those fossil fuel importers accountable in the way that we have already established with the electricity sector. That is not to say that there cannot be more progress or there should not be more progress in the electricity sector. It's to say that we don't even have the basic mechanisms to advance that progress yet in the transportation and thermal sectors the way we do with electricity. And in fact, the Climate Action Plan and the Climate Council did recommend that Vermont move to a 100% carbon-free or 100% renewable energy standard, which would further reduce emissions in our electricity sector. So I always like this slide as a starting point because it allows us to break down these energy sectors and look at how much of our energy use comes from each of them, how much of our greenhouse gas emissions come from each of them, and how much of our energy expenditures or the energy cost burden comes from each of these sectors. And so I'm going to walk through each of these in turn: energy use, emissions, and expenditures. So this shows total energy use in Vermont. The sources for this are the Energy Information Administration, Vermont Department of Public Service, the Agency of Natural Resources. And what we see is that most of our energy use is in the transportation and thermal sectors. There's actually more energy use in residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use for heating primarily. The thermal sector also includes some cooling, but it's primarily heating. But the transportation sector is much higher emitting, about 40% of our total emissions rather than about a third of emissions from the thermal sector, because the transportation sector is so fossil dependent. It's only, it's about 95% fossil fueled, whereas the thermal sector is about 75% fossil fueled. And then we look over here at the electricity sector, which is right now a smaller energy user. Over time, we hope to shift a lot of the energy use that is in these sectors over to our cleaner electricity sector. And no matter how you measure it, whether it is pre-rec accounting or post-rec accounting, our electricity sector is only about 5% fossil fuel in Vermont. So next slide. This shows our emissions over time. And then these green dots show these legal requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act relative to where we've been. I will note that the requirement for 2030 is more than requires more than two times the amount of emissions reduction between 2018 and 2030 as the amount of emissions reduction required between our baseline, our most recent year for emissions data, 2018, and what the numbers need to be for 2025. So there is a lot of work to do, especially to meet this 2030 requirement, which is based on the science, based on the international community's collective commitment to having each country, state, et cetera, do the work that's needed to avoid warming and destabilization of the climate that would be particularly dangerous. So those, and then you can see color coded here where each of these emissions have come from over time. And again, the transportation and thermal sectors being those largest sources of emissions. So again, the Climate Council put together a climate action plan. This is a summary of the emissions reductions that are expected from taking those actions. So it's a major shift from highly polluting, high cost, price volatile fossil fuel vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, to much more efficient, lower polluting, less expensive electric vehicles. Also improvements in the remainder of the vehicle fleet that is internal combustion through vehicle efficiency. And then there's a whole, there are other measures. These are just the ones that are the biggest emissions reducing measures modeled in the plan. And then there's a whole suite of actions for the thermal sector, everything from displacing or replacing fossil fuel heating with air source heat pumps, improving building shells and reducing energy use through weatherization, switching to heat pump water heaters. And there's a role for those harder to electrify heating situations, older, leakier buildings, ones that require a backup or a supplemental source of combustion heat. There is also a limited role for some biofuels and advanced wood heat to replace fossil fuels to further reduce emissions when we can't do everything, unfortunately, through weatherization and electrification. So this shows the targets for those key compliance years of 2025 and 2030 for each of those measures. And what you see in some of these dotted lines is the projected increase of how much progress we can make on that due to actions by the legislature or by the state of Vermont in the last year. So for instance, this Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule that is right now proceeding, the Agency of Natural Resources is working on this, as is the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. If Vermont does that, this dashed gray line shows how much more electric vehicles will be delivered for sale to Vermont than would otherwise happen in a baseline. So that is a major significant strategy to phase out the sale of new combustion, highly polluting, high cost vehicles. But that is just one piece of the strategy. And for these others, while there has been some funding that has been put towards increasing these goals, especially $80 million put towards weatherization last year, thanks to the work of the legislature and the administration, moving this purple line up to this dashed blue line, we're still far short of a lot of these targets. And the big missing piece is policies that would help drive these things. I should note that the new incentives and rebates that are going to be made available through the Inflation Reduction Act are not yet modeled here for Vermont. We did not have that data by the time this report went to press. Another thing I should mention about emissions is that the state, when I'm reporting on emissions, it is using the data from the Agency of Natural Resources and the methodology that they use, which looks at greenhouse gas emissions from the burner tip or from the site energy use. There's another way to look at emissions that the Climate Council and the Agency of Natural Resources are currently conducting a study on, which is full life cycle emissions. This actually summarizes the life cycle emissions benefits of electric vehicles. And in Vermont, using life cycle emissions, we still see a approximately five times emissions reduction from electric vehicles being driven versus internal combustion engines. But there will be more to come on that front, and there's more discussion of life cycle emissions in the annual progress report, which I'll put a link to in the chat right after this. And then so this talks about the economics. The big question is, how does this $6.4 billion in savings and avoided damages come about? And the thing that we need to always remember is the status quo is not cost-free. We are right now dependent on relatively high cost, incredibly price volatile fuels that put a strain on Vermonters' budgets. So this compares gasoline and diesel costs to EV charging rates, which are even lower if there's an off-peak charging rate offered by your utility, as Green Mountain Power and Burlington Electric do. This is a major difference that can lead to significant savings over time. And the same is true on the heating side. The fossil fuels, fuel oil, propane, kerosene, tend to be the highest cost, most price volatile ways to heat a home. And in contrast, when we efficiently use electricity or advanced wood heat, that can bring our monthly or annual energy costs down significantly and lead to much more stability in those costs for Vermonters over time. These are just a few examples of how a lot of people will focus on the upfront price of a vehicle, but not on the lifetime costs of that vehicle or what the costs are after incentives. And so here we've put that lifetime cost along with the lifetime pollution of comparable vehicles. So this is just one example of a Nissan Altima versus an all-electric Nissan Leaf. Not only does the Leaf have a fraction of the carbon pollution, it is also less expensive over the lifetime because of fuel and maintenance savings. And it also can be less expensive for the upfront purchase price after the federal, state, and utility incentives that are available. We have these comparisons for electric pickup trucks, for different, for water heaters, for heat pump water heaters versus fossil water heaters, and for other types of heating systems. These are all available in the report. One of the last things I'll say is that it's also really important that we remember that Vermonters don't all have the same energy experience, and there are significant differences by income. And for instance, some of the highest cost energy sources like fuel oil and kerosene, our lowest income neighbors are disproportionately dependent on. So you see households under the $50,000 in Vermont, somewhere between 45 to 48% use fuel oil or kerosene as a primary heating source. That's a lower share for upper income folks, and upper income folks tend to have higher use and access of lower cost energy sources like wood heating and utility gas as well. So those are just a few things. The last thing I would say is that this is not just about consumer savings, although that is a major opportunity for Vermonters. It's also about the Vermont economy. 100% of the fossil fuel that we import, 100% of the fossil fuel that we use is imported. And on average, 75 cents out of every dollar that we spend on it drains right out of the state economy. And instead, these solutions that can reduce emissions also have the opportunity to strengthen the Vermont economy by keeping more money local, having it recirculate in our communities, and contributing to local jobs. So, 75 cents of every dollar leaving the state when spent on fossil fuels, it's almost the inverse on electricity. About 70 cents of every dollar stays in state when we purchase electricity, going to line workers and tree trimmers and customer service staff at our electric utilities, and clean power purchases, especially local power purchases. So that could be a major shift, having billions of dollars stop leaving the state and instead stay and invest in the Vermont economy as part of this win-win transition. I'm going to end there. Just a reminder that our report is available, the full report, including these graphics that are you can download. If you have any questions about the report, please let me know. That is my email address on the screen. And if you have an event coming up where you'd like to share hard copies of the report, please reach out to our Deputy Director Cara, whose email is there, and we can have copies mailed to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jared. And let's now hear from Representative Kathleen James.
Thanks, Lauren, and thanks everybody for being here. It's really fun to see so many engaged climate activists here on the call with us today. So yeah, as Lauren said, I'm Kathleen James. I represent the Bennington 4 district. That's Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and part of Sunderland. And I serve on the education committee, but have been involved as a leader with the Climate Solutions Caucus. So it's fun to be here to talk with you guys today. I wanted to talk a little bit about climate action in the legislature. It's a very high priority for Democratic leadership and for many of us who serve in the State House and Senate. And I wanted to set up a little bit of framing how I sort of think about climate action in relation to any bill that we're going to pass. So first of all, as everybody on this call knows, climate action is a moral issue. It's imperative that we take action now, action that we should have taken years ago to protect our planet for the future. So the moral component, I think, is a given. Secondly, obviously, as we all know, it's an environmental issue. We all need to do our part to reduce carbon pollution and act as environmental stewards of this planet as individuals, in our communities, as a state, as a nation, and then as citizens of the global world. And finally, and sort of equal urgency, and this is a lens I try to bring to a lot of our bills when we're talking and thinking about them. It's an economic issue. And this is a really important consideration. While it's not happening as quickly as it needs to, the global economy is shifting to renewable energy, and that shift is accelerating, and it's just going to continue to accelerate. And at the same time, we are increasingly seeing the volatile and spiking prices of fossil fuels as the price of gas shoots up at the pump. And we see Vermonters very worried right now, and rightfully so, about the cost of heating fuel this coming winter. So it's an economic dynamic, and it has profound implications for all of us, but mostly for the most vulnerable among us. So when we think about climate action, we need to absolutely be careful to center in those conversations low-income folks, rural folks, historically marginalized communities. And that's why the work of climate justice is so critical. Every solution really needs to be thoughtful and careful that we bring everyone along, and that we're being careful to think about the needs of folks who are the least able to adapt. So that brings me to the legislature, which is a wonderful and noble but very imperfect political body that's made up of 180 state reps and senators. Each of us has our own ideas. We all have our own perspectives. And each of us, importantly, we answer to our own communities and to our own constituents. And that means that the legislature can be a fickle and sometimes kind of an unruly place to get work done. And sometimes it feels like a place where we take one step forward and then a half step back, or we take a step forward and we stall, and then we take another step. So last year we did get some good work done. We passed, as Lauren mentioned at the very beginning of our meeting, we did pass an environmental justice bill. I think that's very important work. I was really happy to vote for that. We allocated significant amounts of funding to weatherization and other climate measures that will help Vermonters weatherize their homes, install more energy efficient heating systems, improve our landscape resilience, mitigate flood hazards. And then in the annual transportation budget, obviously, that's where we fund programs to help low and moderate income Vermonters purchase electric vehicles or more fuel efficient cars. We're investing in charging infrastructure and in public transportation, and also in walking and biking. So we got some stuff done, but we also had some very serious setbacks. The governor vetoed a very important conservation bill, H606, and I'm sure you've all heard of that. That establishes the goal of conserving 30% of the state's land by 2030 and 50% by 50/50 through a combination of private, state, and federal land. That bill was vetoed. He vetoed H926, a bill that would have addressed forest fragmentation and supported wildlife habitat. We all know the important role that that plays in, our climate mitigation measures going forward. And then he also vetoed the clean heat standard. And our attempt to override this veto failed by a single vote. This was, from my point of view, a really serious setback to Vermont achieving its climate goals. The clean heat standard is the single most important recommendation in the Vermont climate plan, one of the three. And while the bill wasn't perfect, and I'm sure there are plenty of folks on this call who understand its imperfections, it would have made huge strides in helping Vermonters have access to more choices and more affordable choices to transition away from fossil fuels and move toward clean energy solutions. And it would have given fossil fuel dealers a predictable path to reduce carbon emissions while diversifying their business models. So I guess what I wanted to say about that is that, in the legislature, one thing I've learned, if there's anything I've learned, is that policy often is iterative. You do as much as you can, you do the best you can, and you try to get something over the finish line. And then you can always, and we always do, return later to revise things, to make them better, to strengthen them. But it's, from my point of view, very important that we not let the perfect become the enemy of the good. And the clean heat standard veto was an important missed opportunity. What's coming up in the next session? It's very early to make those kinds of predictions. I mean, for starters, we're all still running for election and haven't been elected yet. And then once the election happens and we can see who's going to be serving, the serious work will start, with House leadership and with all of our advocates and with the environmental community to set an agenda for 2023, to try to set some lofty goals and try to be realistic also about what we can get done. I think we'll definitely take another run at the 30 by 30 bill. I hope to see that teed up this year. I think there's a lot of conversation and a lot of promise around taking a look at our renewable energy standard. I've been serving on a little informal study group this summer that's just really trying to get familiar with that complex piece of policy. And then I very much hope we're able to take another run at the clean heat standard. Fingers crossed on that one. I think it will happen. I hope it happens in the first year of the biennium. I don't think that's a given either. And one of the reasons why is something that I think Lauren mentioned earlier, is that we are experiencing really high turnover in the legislature this year. We're going to have a lot of new members. We're going to have an unprecedented number of new committee chairs. Chair Briglin, who was chairing energy and technology last year and was a key player in getting the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Clean Heat Standard across the finish line, has retired and gone on to the rest of his life. And so there's going to be a lot of new chairs and a lot of new members. And so there's going to be a huge amount of work to do just with all of us getting educated, getting up to speed, getting to know each other, understanding how the legislature works, how we can all work together, and then deciding what our priorities are, and then undertaking the hard work of getting really complicated, often controversial bills across the finish line. So that's kind of where you guys come in. We had a lot of citizen engagement a couple of years ago when we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act. And I really can't emphasize enough for all of you how important that was, that legislators hear from folks in their communities who support climate work, who support climate bills, who are willing to support their legislators when they get out to take hard votes. It makes a big difference. So I would encourage all of you to really actively engage, in thoughtful conversations with your state reps and with your state senators, with the experts and advocacy groups that are on this call today. And stay tuned, because as the legislative session draws closer, you'll start to see, policy agendas being published and ideas for bills moving around. And, now's the time to get engaged.
Thank you. Oh, great. I was just going to hand it right over to you, Joey. So take it away.
Thanks, Lauren. Thank you, Representative James, for those comments, and more so for everything you and your fellow legislative colleagues and your soon-to-be new colleagues do to actually help make the kind of, overarching systemic progress that we know we need to make for all the, jobs, equity, public health, and other benefits that it offers. Oh, and by the way, doing our part to address a moral crisis. Greta, if you don't mind sharing my slides, I'm going to talk to you all a little bit today about transportation, what's happening in the transportation arena. And I'm just going to set a little bit of a higher context. Greta, you can fast forward that one. Thanks. Because I think there's a lot that's happening that I think would be of interest to you. So before I dig into sort of the legislative landscape, which, as Representative James said, and you'll probably hear from Ben and Chase, there's not a lot of details yet, but we know there's work to do in the legislative arena. So I want to start first with just giving you a little bit of information on what's happening on transportation. There's a lot, but again, as you just heard from Jared, and as I'll share more about with you, there's a lot more to do. We lack a fundamental primary regulatory tool like we have in the electric sector through the renewable energy standard. We don't have a tool like that in the transportation sector, and there's a lot more work to do, and certainly a dire need for one. So I'm going to highlight a few things. First, I just simply want to start by saying, money is a big piece of the climate work right now, across the board, but definitely in the transportation space. So as you are likely well aware, over the last year or so, an unprecedented amount of money came into Vermont from the federal government, including through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, as well as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And thankfully, last year, the legislature made an unprecedented commitment, buoyed by those federal dollars, in climate action. And in the transportation sector, there's a lot of work happening at VTrans and in other state agencies, and likely through many of you, to stand up in new programs and expand new and needed programs, again, buoyed by those federal investments. And those programs include things like electric vehicle incentive programs, programs that help energy overburdened Vermonters move into more fuel efficient vehicles, programs that are not about vehicles, but investing in things like transit, such as fare-free transit, expanding microtransit program investments, sort of little smaller buses that can serve more rural Vermont more efficiently and affordably, and really important bike and pedestrian investments. So a big piece of the climate work in the transportation space right now is to make sure that we maximize those dollars. And at the same time, there are other things happening that I just want to quickly highlight for you that are certainly related to what we are doing and will need to do in the transportation space. As Lauren mentioned, I am a member of the Vermont Climate Council. And as Jared mentioned, the Climate Council in the transportation space had identified the Transportation and Climate Initiative, a regional cap and invest program, to begin to equitably, but certainly make pollution reduction progress in the transportation sector. That program was sort of put on ice right before we adopted the plan in December of 2021. And that means we are back to the drawing board, doing more of the public engagement, research, and analysis that we need to make a recommendation to either dust off and advance the Transportation and Climate Initiative program, or identify and work with you all and others to refine a program that, again, will serve to be at least one, if not one of the needed primary mechanisms to reduce emissions in the transportation sector, as we are legally and morally obligated to do. So there's also work happening, importantly, at the Agency of Transportation. The Transportation is required by the Infrastructure and Jobs Act dollars to develop a carbon reduction plan. And that work is now underway. They've hired a consultant to work with them to examine existing programs, the sort of impact and efficacy and the cost effectiveness of different programs to deliver important outcomes to Vermonters, but also to deliver greenhouse gas emission reductions. So that is an important piece of work that is underway at VTrans. And additionally, through that work, they're also looking to examine other potential policy and regulatory approaches. So ideally, that will be a very important foundation of information for all of us who want to see transformation in the transportation sector to get people where they need to go, cleaner, more efficiently, and through more multimodal options. So I also just want to highlight a couple of other quick things, but I think are very important. Importantly, there's also a vehicle miles traveled analysis underway at VTrans. And this analysis is examining if, how, and how much smart growth strategies affect and help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think this is important because we all know we can't drive our way out of this problem, that we need options to move and get where we need to go that are not necessarily only about the automobile. And we know that there are many benefits from, more multimodal strategies. So that analysis is looking at how do we quantify the greenhouse gas emissions and other benefits that come from non-vehicular options, smart growth strategies, and as they call it, transportation and demand management strategies. Jared also mentioned critically the work at the Agency of Natural Resources to adopt, ideally, the Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Trucks rules. I'm going to share a little bit more about that later too, because of how important that is. And then I also just want to highlight for you, in partnership with regional planning commissions and others, VTrans, Agency of Transportation, is working on a transportation equity framework, which will be an important framework for the state and all of us to help better understand inequities in the current transportation system and potential solutions and strategies to mitigate those impacts. Next slide, please, Greta. I'm going to spend a little less time talking about this, and because it's been mentioned already, but I do want to underscore the importance of the Advanced Clean Car and Advanced Clean Trucks rulemaking that is underway. Just give you a sense of the process there. This is a primary recommendation in the Climate Action Plan because of the pollution reduction benefits that it can help achieve. Vermont is poised to adopt the next iteration of California's rules, ideally by the end of 2022. As you may know, the initial iterations, the earlier iterations of this program have been helping ensure that cleaner, more fuel efficient vehicles are delivered to Vermont and available to Vermonters for many years now. This is the next iteration of that, so that as the world moves to electrify a lot and electrify the vehicle fleet, that this program is an obligation on vehicle manufacturers to deliver more clean light duty electric vehicles, to deliver more heavy, medium to heavy duty vehicles. And in the light duty vehicle space, what it means is that by 2035, manufacturers would be required to deliver only clean electric vehicles. So new vehicles delivered to Vermont starting in 2035 would be electric, a little less of an onus in the medium to heavy duty vehicle space because of the recognition that we just don't have the technology yet to transform that type of heavier duty fleet. So there's more flexibility there. And this work is, ANR is about to deliver the results of their public engagement that they've been undertaking this fall. and synthesizing that into deliver a report by November 1st to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. And ideally, LCAR will take up those rules and advance them for adoption by the end of this year, so that Vermonters can begin to avail themselves of cleaner, more cost-effective vehicles beginning in model year 2026. And the last slide, Greta, and I just want to sort of speak quickly to, again, the sort of legislative landscape with the election underway and a lot of moving parts is, coming into more clear form, and we'll be sure to host another webinar or find other webinar ways to communicate with you more clearly about different priorities and the upcoming sessions. But a few things I just wanted to highlight for you that will certainly be happening is there are two big bills related to transportation that the legislature tackles. One is called the Transportation Bill, otherwise known affectionately as the T-bill. This is a must-pass bill. It's largely a budget and a money bill. So that where there will be a lot of conversation related to that bill this coming session. As a reminder, there was a significant commitment last year in the T-bill to climate action, particularly to electric vehicles, among other things. For 2023, I think there is an opportunity to focus more on investments in non-vehicular options, especially as we, work with VTrans to push last year's commitments of dollars out the door to get more Vermonters into cleaner, more fuel-efficient vehicles to save them money. So there's work to implement existing investments. And then this coming session, there are a few very important programs like the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grants Program that is really focused on, again, helping make commitments and innovation at the community level to, again, get Vermonters where they need to go, not just by vehicles, but through other innovative strategies. And I think more opportunity to look at bike and pedestrian programs, grants, electric vehicle incentives. The $50,000 that the legislature invested last year in EV bike incentives went quickly. I think there's more of a commitment we can make there, and to other things like electric vehicle charging at multifamily dwellings, workplaces, et cetera, so that as we make this transition, we're thinking about and preparing our communities for, especially preparing communities and Vermonters who, have lower incomes and are, transportation access is more of a challenge, to make it easier, more accessible, affordable to everyone. So work going to happen in the T-bill, and then in the miscellaneous Department of Motor Vehicles bill. This is the last thing I'll say. This is a more policy focused bill, but there's a real need and an opportunity, to use that more policy focused bills to drive important priorities like Complete Streets. Complete Streets is a program that Vermont has had on the books for a while, but it is not required. Complete Streets is really focused around designing and developing streets that accommodate all road users, not just cars. So that when VTrans is repaving or redoing a bridge, they should be designing that to support bicyclists and pedestrians, to make more complete streets that serve people and not just vehicles. And lastly, there are other strategies, for example, identified in the Climate Action Plan, this concept of a vehicle efficiency price adjuster that would be sort of a fee at the point of sale to incentivize cleaner vehicles. So those kinds of strategies may be in the hopper for this session. But I just wanted to sort of underscore there is a lot happening and a lot more work to do. And this, I hope, will give you just a glimpse at some of the bigger buckets of work in the transportation sector. And until then, there's also more work to do in the thermal and heating sector. And to give you a glimpse of that, I'm going to turn it over to Ben to tell you more about what's happening there.
Thanks so much, Joey. So I will be relatively brief. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, and also take that as a friendly reminder that if you do have questions, please drop them at the chat. If you get them in there now, it's just going to be a little bit easier for us once we get to the Q&A. So Greta, if you could throw up those slides of mine. I'm gonna, there's a lot going on in the thermal sector, the heating space, as it were. As has been noted, there was a lot of funding put towards low-income weatherization, moderate income weatherization, electrification, last legislative session. But I'm really going to focus on the clean heat standard and how we can really start to clean up the thermal sector as a whole, rather than kind of chipping around the edges. Greta, can you pull that up, or should I go ahead and do that?
I've got it. 1 second. Sorry, Ben.
No worries. The clean heat standard, as has been noted by Jared and Representative James, is a policy that would, for the first time in the history of the state of Vermont, take an entire energy sector and require that it, in fact, hit the climate pollution requirements that we have as a state, and in fact, require the companies in that sector to make that happen. That's something that's never been done. We have a renewable energy standard, which does have some requirements. You'll hear more about how we think we can improve that from Chase, from CLF in a moment. But even that, while it's a sector-wide policy, is not actually based on a requirement to hit our greenhouse gas goals in that sector. This would be. And really notably, for the first time ever, it would require fossil fuel companies in or selling fossil fuels into the state of Vermont to, in fact, achieve climate pollution reductions that we know are necessary, and do that on a schedule that would actually have us hit our climate pollution reduction requirements from the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2030 and 2050. Greta, go ahead and get to the next slide. So there are three. So I want to start this by saying we think this policy has an enormous promise. It really is something that should happen in the state of Vermont. That being said, there were a lot of changes, improvements made to it over the course of last legislative session. And we think there are really important ways that it can continue to be improved, and in fact needs to continue to be improved, especially in this sort of new world with the Inflation Reduction Act, really maximizing the benefits of that. I will go through these three categories. I do want to note that these are essentially the same categories of improvements that we were pushing for all through last legislative session, and got quite a lot of movement in the bill. If you look at the difference between the as introduced version versus the as vetoed version, as passed version. So these are not new concepts. They are concepts we're continuing to focus on and see some real opportunities to continue to improve on. So category number one is modifying the bill to really accelerate electrification and efficiency, which is essentially weatherization in the heating sector, and really minimize combustion technologies, biofuels, RNG, et cetera. And there's a couple of really important reasons for this. One, if you look at, from a cost, from an equity standpoint, electrification and weatherization, those are the places we've got real opportunities to make it easier for Vermonters to make ends meet, to make it, to reduce the energy burden on all Vermonters, especially low and moderate income Vermonters. You don't end up in the same kind of situation where you see prices spike over and over again every few years that we've seen, going back decades in the fossil fuel sector, shifting to electrification and just reducing energy use overall by weatherizing as many buildings in Vermont as possible is really an opportunity towards, or a path towards more equity and lower energy burdens, and a lot of economic benefit, as Jared mentioned, to the state. And on the combustion side, this is sort of the flip side of the same coin. Of course, if you're maximizing efficiency and electrification, then you are reducing the amount that you're burning things, anything, fossil fuels, biofuels, et cetera. And that's really important. Obviously, there are, even for very clean, relatively speaking, biofuels that are in fact better from a greenhouse gas standpoint than fossil fuels. They are still not as good from a greenhouse gas standpoint as electrification and efficiency. And then the other thing that's really important to note is burning anything, it's bad for people's health, right? It's bad for your lungs, it's bad for your heart, it's bad for kids' asthma. That is a very real thing, and it's something that, you know, sort of the more marginalized a community is, the more likely it is to be impacted by. So there are a lot of good health equity and economic and greenhouse gas reasons to maximize electrification efficiency and minimize combustion. So we'll be pushing in that direction. To continue to improve the bill in terms of how it advances equity. The bill as it stands has, I would argue, that the strongest, certainly some of the strongest equity provisions of any bill touching energy that the state has ever considered. And the reason is it has very clear, explicit direction to the Public Utilities Commission that essentially 2/3 of the benefit of the clean heat standard in the residential sector would need to flow to low and medium income Vermonters. There are precise numbers in the bill. I'm rounding a little bit as I'm describing it to you, but that's really important that we are not mincing words with the PUC when we're talking about equity, because they have not gotten it right historically. And so there was a lot of work done last year on that. There are ways that the bill could continue to be improved. In particular, there's a real need to make sure that we're minimizing the upfront costs for low and moderate income Vermonters of these kinds of technologies, because there's a lot of opportunity here, but it is not an opportunity that is easy for people, or in many cases possible for people who do not have a lot of income to take advantage of. Last thing I'll note here, before I touch on life cycle analysis and then turn it over to Chase to talk about the electric sector, is you may have noticed when Jared had his slide deck up, there was one slide that went by sort of income across the bottom, and then type of fuel up, as in this stacked bar chart. And if you look at the lowest income Vermonters in that chart, what you see is a lot of electricity being used to heat homes. That's not cold climate heat pumps. That's almost entirely, for very low income Vermonters, the most expensive way to heat your home, traditional, resistance electric heating. The other thing you see a lot of, which sort of gets lost in that particular bar graph, is people heating with propane and only getting a little bit at a time because that's what they can afford to buy. And that's the other most expensive way you can possibly heat your home in the winter. And so I think the thing that I would stress more than anything, more than any one sort of tweak to the policy we could make, is we can't keep on doing the things that way that we've been doing them. We have to do something different in the heating sector. It said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And when I hear people say, we just can't possibly afford to do something like the clean heat standard because oil's too expensive. Like, can you imagine if we had done this 10 or 15 years ago, how many Vermont families would not be struggling to make ends meet right now because their oil bill doubled year over year, right? Like, we need to get this right, but we need to do it. We need to actually transform the sector. Last thing I'll mention briefly, and I'm not going to get into the weeds here. I know there are people on this call who would really love to, go 10 rounds on life cycle analysis. The thing that I really want to stress here is when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions for biofuels, for RNG, it is critically important we get that right. And it is critically important we don't create any incentives for people to create more pollution so they can capture that pollution and sell it to people who are heating buildings. That is just an absolutely ridiculous outcome, and it is not outside the realm of possibility if you don't do a policy like this well. And so we're very aware of that, and we are very keyed into improving that bill even more than it was last year, so that that sort of outcome simply doesn't happen. So I'm going to turn it over to Chase to talk a little bit about the electric sector, and then we should have a solid 20 minutes, I think, after he's wrapped to get into Q&A. I saw a lot of chat bubbles popping up there, so rest assured I will try to cover what I can in that 15-20 minutes we have for Q&A.
Thanks, Ben. And hello, all of you. It's good to see your faces in the Zoom boxes. Thanks for your time today and for engaging on these issues. I don't know if you all caught the United Nations report that was just released in the last handful of hours, over the past day or so. But the high level takeaway is that the countries of this world are not making the progress that is necessary to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius, that we're behind, and that the window of time to make those changes is still open, but very rapidly closing. The urgency that we have to act is realer than it has ever been before. And with each passing day of inaction, the urgency grows yet more. So just to set the table with the need for rapid action as we're approaching this next legislative session, and a great opportunity to engage in such action, I wanted to speak specifically about Vermont's renewable energy standard, which deals with Vermont's electricity. So I think if there's only one thing that I can say today, it would be that clean electricity is the linchpin to reducing climate pollution across the entire economy. Vermont needs abundant clean electricity, not just to reduce electricity in the electricity sector, but really to clean up the transportation sector and also the building sector. That's why clean electricity is the linchpin to reducing climate pollution across the entire economy. We need it. We need clean electricity to clean up all of the other sectors. To make it concrete, we need to deploy hundreds of thousands of electric vehicles in Vermont, and we need to deploy hundreds of thousands of heat pumps across Vermont. Those things are going to be running on electricity. And so to make those concrete actions possible and work from a climate perspective, we need to use only clean electricity, because electric vehicles and heat pumps are only as clean as the electricity they run on. And we need to make sure that Vermont is increasing the amount of new clean electricity that it has, because more electric vehicles, more heat pumps is going to mean a greater demand for electricity. So we need to clean the electricity up, and we need to have a lot more of that clean electricity if we're going to achieve the climate reductions in the transportation space and in the building space, as well as to continue cleaning up the electricity space. So the way that we can do this is by reforming Vermont's current renewable energy standard. So I'm going to hit on two things next. One is just a brief sort of summary of where things are right now in Vermont policy, and then a brief sort of high-level discussion of where things need to go. So right now, Vermont has its renewable energy standard, which you might hear folks refer to as the RES or as the RES. It's a state level policy, and it mandates a minimum share of Vermont's electricity come from renewable energy sources. It was passed back in 2015, and it requires that 75% of Vermont's electricity come from renewable energy sources, and that we reach that goal of 75% by the year 2032. So 10 years from now, basically. Within that is also a goal that 10% of the electricity, of that renewable electricity, be generated from inside Vermont. So it's important here just to pause for a second. The goal is 75% renewable electricity, and 10% of that 75% should come from in-state. Just sometimes folks get a little confused and think, well, 75% plus 10% means really 85%. But that's not what's happening here under the renewable energy standard. It's really a total of 75% with 10% coming in state. So the RES was enacted in 2015, and it has been significant in its impact in cleaning up the electricity sector. It has led to very large and meaningful greenhouse gas emissions reductions. However, the RES remains incomplete. And as already noted, reforming the RES is going to be critical to making the changes, the greenhouse gas emission reduction changes that are necessary in the transportation and building sector. So another thing to sort of keep in mind of where we are right now is that when the RES was initially passed back in 2015, having 75% of our electricity come from renewables by the year 2032 seemed like the outer limits of what would be possible at that time. However, the continued advances in renewable energy technology and the commensurate drop in the cost of deploying those renewable energies have made increases beyond 75% practical and possible and cost effective. And of course, the accelerating climate crisis that we find ourselves in has made those additional changes necessary. The time to act is now. We really don't have time to delay. So that's where things are now. I next want to just spend a little bit of time discussing where things need to go, and then I'll close up. So to ensure that Vermont is able to do its part to reduce climate pollution and keep global climate change within the bounds necessary to sustain human life for our children and our grandchildren, Vermont should reform the renewable energy standard to require 100% of all electricity come from renewable energy, and to require new additional in-state electricity generation. So the bullet points, or sort of the high-level policy discussions there, will be around making sure that 100% of Vermont's electricity is renewable. Increasing the amount of new in-state renewable energy generation, so no less than 20% of the state's electricity be renewable by 2030, and no less than 30% of the state's electricity be renewable by 2035, helping to push forward the development of new additional clean electricity, which we're going to need to power the transportation and the thermal sectors. Next is phasing out as eligible under the renewable energy standard those electricity generation sources that produce toxic air pollutants or greenhouse gas emissions. Underlying that is the observation that not everything that is technically renewable is in fact clean. As Ben noted, combustion sources produce harmful toxic air pollutants, and the burdens that are borne by those toxic air pollutants often fall most heavily on communities that have historically been marginalized. And also some renewable energy sources, those that require combustion, they produce greenhouse gas emissions. And so although technically renewable, some sources, in fact, help harm our progress towards reducing climate pollution. The next high-level thing is ensuring that a res reform advance clearly equity interests such as equity of ownership, access, health, and costs. So, for example, ensuring that a res enable community-level solar projects that can allow for entire communities to share in and participate in the ownership and access to the clean energy transition, as well as ensuring that rooftop solar be made available for lower and moderate income folks, so that all Vermonters, and in particular historically marginalized Vermonters, can share in the access and the ownership to truly clean forms of energy. Done right, those types of policies will help to reduce costs for Vermonters, especially for lower and moderate income Vermonters. And done right, the types of energy sources that could be used in those ways could be those with the least health impacts, those that don't require combustion that would produce toxic air pollutants. Also, when thinking through equity, the siting of energy sources and what those energy sources are matters. Again, hearkening back to the human health impacts, some energy sources can be sited in or adjacent to communities and to people who then bear the burden of what that might be. So if there's a combustion process that produces fine particulate matter or other toxic air pollutants, siting that type of facility next to a community directly impacts that community. And so we need to ensure that a res reform will prevent those types of environmental justice issues from continuing. And lastly, a res reform should look to the formation of and leveraging of current such entities, but the formation of an advisory group to help ensure that the res be reformed and implemented in the most equitable ways possible. That's it for me.
Thank you, Chase. And thank you, all of our speakers. That was a lot of information. And as everyone was speaking, really grateful for the robust conversation happening in the chat. This is a super engaged and well-informed group with lots of good ideas. And thanks for both asking and answering each other's questions in the chat with a lot of great information. We will capture this, as Joey mentioned in the chat at one point. This is really good feedback and input that us advocates will capture and also take into consideration. We do have a bunch of questions and we'll try to get to, we're trying to kind of lump some of the conversations and get to as many of the issues as we can. One thing I just wanted to mention before getting into the detailed questions, because I know people will probably start needing to drop off over the next few minutes. Thank you for hanging in there for an hour-and-a-half webinar. Just wanted to mention some of the ways that folks can get and stay engaged and kind of important ways to make your voice heard on these issues. You know, first and foremost, as Vermont conservation voters, we all know it's an election season right now. Helping elect and support pro-climate action candidates is essential. Having the right people in office, the kind of leaders like Representative James and many of her allies in the Climate Solutions Caucus and others, is really what it takes to get the kinds of really meaningful climate policies across the finish line. You can see at, you know, Vermont Conservation Voters, VPIRG Votes, some of our allies have endorsement lists of pro-environment candidates, and we've got volunteer opportunities to get involved. So that's one way, you know, and of course, make sure you vote and encourage your friends and neighbors to vote for pro-climate candidates as well. We've got the VCAN conference coming up, which I think Greta can put some additional information in the chat. But that in early mid-December is always a great place to connect with other community leaders and groups of all, you know, amazing projects going on around the state, and learn more ways, you know, more details on the policy when we're a little closer to the session. And that's a great way to stay informed and engaged. We've got the climate dispatch that VNRC and VCV work to put out during the legislative session every week to give a quick update on what's happening at the State House and timely ways that you can get involved and engaged. I know VPIRG's Keep Vermont Cool campaign has some great stuff coming up. So I saw Jordan on here. Hopefully she can put some links and information from the Keep Vermont Cool campaign and opportunities with that. And I know there's a bunch of other organizations represented here. So if you've got ways to stay upcoming events or ways that you want to connect with people, please just put that in the chat so folks can have a sense of all the great ways to get involved, because really, you know, to do the kind of work we have ahead of us, Chase really underscored the urgency. You know, you'll see the headlines from the UN report and it's like we're on track for catastrophic climate change unless we change course. You know, it's going to take us all being aligned, being engaged, and really making our voices heard in effective ways to make the kind of change that we need and act on the policies we've been hearing about today. So thanks for all that I know you will do. So now let's get into some of the meaty questions that you all were asking about. There were a lot of details. Let's see, one that we could start with, because I think it comes up a lot. And I'm going to dump this one to Ben, I think. Can you talk about workforce issues and kind of related to how are we going to actually get this work done? I know that's something that the legislature has been thinking a lot about, and many people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lauren. And I just want to say I've been loving reading through the questions. There's just a ton of fantastic thought being put into these, and it's a lot of issues that we've been grappling with for a long time. On workforce, so two things I'd say. One, there was an omnibus workforce bill that covered a lot of ground, did touch on the energy sector this past legislative session. It had at one point some funding dedicated to training in the sort of clean energy space, especially, you know, weatherization, HVAC, the kinds of questions that have been coming up in the chat. Unfortunately, the Scott administration pushed back on that and essentially said they wanted it to be all energy. So you could, you know, train a propane truck driver just as quickly as you could train someone to weatherize a home. We pushed back pretty hard on that. We're able to get some improved language, but it still really enables even training in the fossil fuel sector, which is really unfortunate. So that's one. Two is whether or not we had gotten exactly the language we were hoping for, it just wasn't enough. There definitely needs to be more training in that sector. And anyone who's looking hard at the numbers, for heat pumps, for what homes weatherized, pretty quickly comes to the conclusion we just need more people doing this work, and that is a real challenge, and is an area that we need to keep on working on. So I did want to just grab one or two other questions while I had the floor before I turn it back over to Lauren. I noticed a question in there. I can't remember who asked it about home electrification and the sort of upgrades that you might need to make to a home's electrical systems to actually have an EV charger or have a heat pump. In some cases, there was $20 million put into funding those sorts of upgrades for low and moderate income Vermonters this past legislative session. We strongly supported that. That's a good start. The Inflation Reduction Act also is investing in those areas. There'll be rebates for low and moderate income Vermonters that will flow through the state of Vermont from that bill. There are also tax credits that are in that space. So there's been a lot of movement. That's not to say that any of that's a panacea, but it's definitely much better situation than we were a couple of years ago or even a year ago in that space. I'll stop there. I'm so tempted to keep on answering questions. There's so much good stuff in there, but I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
Thanks, Ben. I'm sure I'll get another chance. How about let's get to some of the transportation questions. And Joey, if you could speak, there was a lot of conversation in the chat about electric vehicles and range and charging stations. And if you could just kind of speak to the state of affairs around EV charging and opportunities and kind of like state of affairs and what's next. It seemed to be a lot of interest there.
Yeah, and for good reason. I think you're raising some important questions and concerns, but I would say that, again, when it came to the federal dollars that came down, a lot of those dollars were directed to begin to really accelerate the deployment of our electric vehicle charging system, strategically around, the highways, but also in focusing more of those EV chargers at multifamily dwellings, at public places, at workplaces, to meet more people, and ideally all people, so that we can help all Vermonters begin to access and avail themselves of those opportunities. So that's a massive initiative underway at VTrans to really begin to rapidly build out that network, and far more work's going to need to be done there, but it's really exciting and important, and it's just the beginning to begin to really tamp down on range anxiety. And when programs like Advanced Clean Cars and Advanced Clean Trucks move forward as well, that's really going to accelerate the need for generating, providing those charging stations at places where Vermonters are. So a lot is happening there, and a lot more needs to happen. But I can drop in the chat here in just a minute a link to the page at VTrans, which you can learn far more about the EV charging plans and the network that they're deploying. And then I would also, just because several folks have asked about this, as we ramp to electrify a lot and we have more fuel efficient vehicles, that obviously is having significant impact on, transportation funding, which a lot of our funding comes through the gas tax. So there certainly is a need to look very broadly at how we fund our transportation system. VTrans, I will also drop this in the chat, has begun its analysis of this and has undertaken a road usage charge study, and has an advisory committee put together to begin to really examine this and make recommendations for, as we electrify and become more efficient, how do we ensure that all people who are using that road system in an equitable way participate in paying for it. So there's a lot happening, but the need, remains there. And let me drop a couple of things in the chat.
Thank you so much. There were a couple questions, some really interesting kind of comments and discussion about regenerative agriculture, about sustainable forestry. Obviously, a lot of issues and could go really deep there. I think just one kind of quick response on that, and one thing to keep an eye on is one of the bills that Representative James mentioned, the 30 by 30 bill, which was looking at how are we as a state looking at our land use and looking at our conservation and practices that are looking at how we're sequestering carbon on the landscape. And that bill would really be a bigger kind of assessment of where do we have resources on the landscape, what kind of conservation do we need to do, how do our farms fit into that. And I think it could be a really useful way to help look at the kinds of policies that we need, like regenerative ag incentives and stuff were mentioned in the chat. I think that is one tool that would be a really helpful kind of comprehensive look at our landscape that, unfortunately, again, the governor vetoed that bill, but hopefully it will be back and we can get it over the finish line. But, lots more work to do there, but that's one policy that we're going to be keeping an eye on for VCV. There's lots of questions about the electric sector. Chase, could you speak a little bit to, let's see, people are asking about the grid. Is it, ready for this rapid growth in electric use? And a couple questions about kind of the PUC and how are they thinking about, why are they thinking about a floor, not a ceiling? Are they the ones that are kind of the gatekeeper for incentivizing solar? So maybe just speaking about how the policies that we're thinking about in the electric sector could be addressing kind of how the PUC would approach the electric sector moving forward.
Sure. Yeah, and there's so much there. So I'll try to be as concise as possible. And if anybody wants to follow up on this, please feel free to reach out afterwards. Be happy to. So the current renewable energy standard basically sets, as it's interpreted now, the ceiling for the in-state clean electricity generation, which is 10% by 2032. So we haven't even gotten to that 10% requirement yet. And the Public Utility Commission often interprets that as known as a ceiling and not as the floor. One way to address that sort of dynamic would be to reform the renewable energy standard to make clear that there should be no less than 20% in-state clean electricity generation by the year 2030. So that doubles the amount from 10% to 20%. It moves the timeline up from 2032 to 2030, and it specifically uses the language no less than, making very clear that what we're talking about really is a floor, not a ceiling. Going above 20% would be good. And then saying no less than, a larger number, 30%, say by 2035. Same sort of thing. So that's one sort of concrete and specific way that could be really beneficial and helpful. And it would begin in the legislature in our democratic system of checks and balances. The legislature provides the guidance and the direction to the Public Utility Commission. And so with that guidance, that's when we could see the policies change on the ground at the PUC. So much more we could talk about. If anyone has another specific question, I'd be really happy to engage.
Great, thank you. And I think we're just about out of time. I just wanted to give, if there were any questions that you saw or issues that you were tracking in the chat that you wanted a chance to respond to, or any kind of wrap up thoughts, since the others got a chance to answer some questions.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that for the questions about the future of our electricity usage and what that means for transmission and distribution and our grid, there's a great report from Velco. I'll look for that and put it in the chat, the long range transmission plan. But we summarize some of that on page 32 of this annual progress report. And a long story short is that because Vermont has invested so much and been so successful in reducing both our peak, especially our peaks in the summer and in the winter, that there is more room to utilize our electricity than we had, for instance, back in 2006, when our peak loads were much higher. That doesn't mean that there is not work. There is important work that needs to be done to continue to invest in and improve our transmission and distribution system, but there is a lot of headroom and capacity in our system because we've invested so much and made so much progress on electric efficiency over the last couple of decades. And Velco does not see any challenges, or they see only minimal challenges that are addressable, modeling out the scale of electrification that the Climate Action Plan calls for by 2030. So there's more on that there. Would encourage people to look at Velco's long range transmission report if they're interested in the kind of deeper treatment of that. For the higher level, there's in the electricity section of the EAN annual report, there's more discussion of that.
Great, thank you so much. We're at 1:28. I'll just, if any of our other speakers have any last things, raise your hand. Otherwise, oh, Ben, it's like Ben, can't help. So.
I can't help myself. I won't answer any more questions. I just wanted to end on a high note. Basically, this is this moment where we're reading every day about the climate crisis and how dire it is. And I mean, this morning in the New York Times, right? Like, it's just so easy to give up hope. It is also a moment of unbelievable opportunity. Nobody expected the Inflation Reduction Act to happen. It was not everything. It was not Bernie's $20 trillion plan. Like, I don't want to pretend that it was, but if we all do our jobs really, really well, we can make that bill a lot more than Joe Manchin meant it to be, right? We can actually accelerate far faster than they anticipated when they built that bill. And we can bring a lot of benefits into the state of Vermont, hundreds of millions of dollars of federal investments if we act versus if we don't. And those hundreds of millions of dollars are going to benefit Vermont families and Vermont businesses. And I'm just so heartened by the 150 people who are here today, the thought you're clearly putting into this, and just really, really looking forward to working with all of you to make this happen this coming legislative session and beyond. So thank you so much for coming today.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks to all our speakers. Thank you, Representative James, for your leadership, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. And we'll keep you posted as we continue to refine and develop a legislative agenda and next steps for climate action in Vermont. We look forward to seeing you all soon, and thanks again for joining us. Take care. Bye.